It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The culmination of months of planning, fittings, tastings, guest lists, floral arrangements, all crafted with precision and love. She had imagined every detail since childhood, the walk down the aisle, the way the music would swell, the moment her husband would see her for the first time. But nowhere in those daydreams had she pictured betrayal stitched into the fabric of her wedding. The morning she went to retrieve her dress, the one she had chosen with tears in her eyes and her heart bursting, was the moment everything changed. It was gone. Vanished from its protective bag, removed without a trace, without explanation. Only later would the truth surface: her own sister had taken it. Worn it. Stolen not just a garment, but the moment, the memory, the magic. And in that instant, standing in the empty space where her dress should have been, she realized something deeper had been taken from her long before the zipper was ever pulled shut. This wasn't just about a wedding dress. It was about every time she had stayed silent, every wound she had wrapped in politeness, every time she had stepped aside so someone else could shine. But not this time. This time, she would not crumble. This time, she would not disappear. She would walk down that aisle, just not
Emily
in the way
had
anyone
always
expected.
lived
In the shadow of her older sister, Victoria. From their earliest days growing up in their modest suburban home, there had been an unspoken rule in their family: Victoria came first. She was the golden child, the achiever, the polished version of what their parents had always hoped for. Emily, on the other hand, was quieter, more introspective, someone who preferred stories and sketchbooks over awards and attention. Their parents never said it outright, but the favoritism hung in the air like humidity on a hot summer day, heavy, invisible, and impossible to ignore. Family dinners were always the same. Victoria would arrive with tales of new accomplishments, promotions, and travel plans. Emily would listen, smile politely, and nod while poking at her food. Whenever she tried to share her own experiences, whether about a new job, a small personal victory, or even something as simple as a new recipe she'd tried, the attention would quietly drift away, as though her voice didn't carry the same weight in the room. Their mother would smile thinly, her father would cough and change the subject, and Victoria would offer a well-meaning but condescending compliment, expertly delivered with just enough sugar to conceal the bite. It wasn't always easy for Emily to explain the dynamic to others. On paper, everything looked fine. They weren't the kind of family that yelled or broke dishes. They celebrated birthdays, hosted holiday dinners, took family photos. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet imbalance. A hierarchy not based on age or experience, but on something far more elusive: perception. Victoria was the achiever, the symbol of success, the one who could do no wrong. Emily was kind, yes, but often treated like an afterthought, a sweet accessory to the family story rather than a central character. Despite this, Emily never stopped trying to earn their attention. She became the peacemaker, the helper, the one who remembered birthdays and organized gifts. When their parents needed errands done, she volunteered. When Victoria needed help with anything, moving, shopping, advice, Emily was there. She told herself it was what sisters did. What families did. That eventually, her efforts would be seen for what they were: love, loyalty, a desire to be included. But year after year, the same pattern repeated. Her giving was received, but never reciprocated in kind. She had always been more sensitive to the small gestures that revealed the truth. The way her parents' eyes lit up when Victoria entered the room. The way her mother gushed when describing Victoria to friends but barely mentioned Emily. The way her father casually brushed off her ideas but hung onto every word Victoria said. These were the cuts that didn't bleed but left scars nonetheless. And still, Emily smiled through it, not out of weakness but resilience. She believed in kindness, even when it wasn't returned. She believed in family, even when it didn't quite believe in her. When she met Jake, it felt like someone had finally seen her. Not just her reflection in comparison to someone else, but the full scope of her, the creativity, the patience, the soft edges that were always mistaken for fragility. He listened when she spoke, laughed at her jokes, noticed her small habits. For the first time, Emily felt chosen. Not tolerated, not conveniently included, but truly wanted. It was a feeling so unfamiliar it frightened her at first. But she leaned into it, allowed herself to believe she could have something of her own. Something not pre-approved by her parents or borrowed from the space Victoria left behind. Their engagement came as a quiet moment of joy. Jake proposed on a rainy afternoon in the kitchen, with flour on his hands and sincerity in his voice. There was no spectacle, just love. Emily said yes, of course she did, and for a moment the world tilted in her favor. She called her parents right away. Her mother's voice carried a note of surprise, followed by polite congratulations. Her father asked what kind of ring he gave her. Victoria, when she called, made a brief joke about being the bridesmaid again, but didn't hide the sharpness in her tone. Emily brushed it off. She was used to that edge. But this time, it didn't matter as much. As the wedding planning began, Emily found herself hesitating. Not because of the commitment, but because she already knew how her family would react, or fail to. She kept things small, simple, focused on what mattered to her. She chose a quiet venue with a garden and natural light, picked out local vendors, handmade decorations, and designed her own invitations. Jake supported every decision. She didn't want a wedding that mimicked what others had done. She wanted one that reflected who they were, quietly joyful, honest, real. But even in the early stages, there were signs that old patterns hadn't changed. Victoria offered to help but rarely followed through. When she did show up to appointments or meetings, she offered backhanded compliments, critiques masked as suggestions. That color washes you out. Are you sure this place isn't too modest? You know, Eve always imagined a wedding with a string quartet, don't you want something a bit more elegant? Emily smiled through it all. She was used to that tone, that way Victoria had of reframing everything to sound helpful while subtly asserting control. What stung the most wasn't Victoria's comments, it was her mother's response to them. She would nod along, echo suggestions, rarely standing up for Emily's choices. It was as though, despite all Emily's efforts to become her own woman, her family still saw her as the little sister following behind. And perhaps they always would. Still, Emily pressed on. She wasn't planning this wedding for them. She was planning it for herself. For Jake. For the version of her that had waited quietly for so many years, hoping someone would finally hear her voice. She chose every detail with care, every flower and every thread of her dress, not for perfection but for meaning. The dress, especially, was important. It wasn't just a garment, it was the symbol of a future she had claimed for herself. One that didn't depend on her sister's approval or her parents' gaze. She found it in a small boutique run by a woman who sewed each gown by hand. The moment she tried it on, she knew, it wasn't just the dress she wanted to wear on her wedding day. The days leading up to the wedding that finally made her feel like she belonged in the story she had written for herself. She floated between final calls with vendors, for the first time in a long while. Emily believed that maybe, double-checking seating charts, this trying to stay grounded as the weight of the moment began to build. There was a kind of magic in the air, delicate and personal, the kind she had always imagined feeling before a life-changing event. She was exhausted but happy, filled with anticipation. Jake had taken over most of the logistical concerns to let her focus on the emotional and personal details, the kind that made the day feel real. And at the center of it all, hanging in a zipped garment bag in the guest bedroom closet, was her wedding dress. It had become more than just fabric. It was her triumph, the manifestation of all the little pieces of herself she had tried to protect from a world that too often told her she was less. Every time she peeked into the bag to run her hand over the delicate lace or press out a barely there wrinkle, she felt grounded again, reminded that she was about to step into a moment she had earned with patience, grace, and quiet strength. It was one of the few things in her life that felt completely untouched by outside influence, by family interference, by comparison. 3 days before the wedding, Emily woke up feeling strangely at peace. The major tasks were done. Everything was in motion. She brewed coffee, walked barefoot through the living room with a playlist humming low in the background, and decided she'd finally try on the dress one last time to make sure the alterations still fit just right. She went into the guest bedroom, humming softly, and opened the closet door. The garment bag was gone. At first, she blinked, confused, certain she had looked in the wrong spot. She searched the room carefully, even though there were only a handful of places it could be. She checked the linen closet, the coat rack near the door, the laundry area. Her calm slowly gave way to confusion, then panic. Within minutes, her heart was racing. She called Jake, her voice tight but measured, trying not to seem alarmed. He hadn't moved it. He hadn't touched it. They both knew what that meant, but neither of them said it out loud. Emily's mind raced through possibilities. A break-in? A mistake by the dry cleaner? But no, she had never sent it out. It had stayed here, protected, untouched. The only people who had been in the house in the past week were her mother, who stopped by briefly to drop off candles, and Victoria. 2 days earlier, her sister had come over, unannounced, with a bottle of wine and vague offers of help. Emily had been surprised but too distracted to question it. Victoria had wandered through the rooms, commented on the color palette, and even peeked at the seating chart, chuckling softly to herself. She had asked about the dress, but Emily, guarding it like a secret, had simply smiled and said she'd see it soon enough. Now, the absence of that dress filled the entire apartment. It echoed off the walls, lingered in the corners. Emily sat on the floor of the guest room, the closet door still open, her fingers trembling slightly. A hollow space had replaced what had once been a symbol of hope. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from the fog. It was a text from Victoria, a casual message about their parents' arrival time and whether she should bring extra champagne. No mention of the dress. No explanation. Just a tone of cool detachment, the same kind of carefully measured distance Victoria had always maintained when she did something she could not deny, but would never admit. Emily felt the breath catch in her chest. She wanted to believe there was another explanation, but she knew. Somewhere deep inside, she knew. The ache in her stomach wasn't just from shock, it was from recognition. This wasn't new. It was just louder. Just larger. Just undeniable. She tried to think clearly. There was still time. She could find another dress. Maybe not the same one, not the one she had poured her heart into, but something. She made a list in her head, started researching emergency bridal shops, calling a few places, her voice tight and unconvincing. But it all felt hollow. How could she walk down the aisle in something else, knowing what had been taken from her? Knowing who had taken it? Memories started surfacing, uninvited. The time Victoria had borrowed Emily's favorite sweater and returned it stained. The time she had signed up for the same art class just to keep Emily company and then subtly undermined her efforts at every turn. The time she had charmed Emily's college crush at a party and then acted surprised when he stopped calling. These weren't isolated events. They were part of a pattern, a quiet erosion of boundaries, a relentless need to prove superiority, disguised as sisterhood. But this was different. This was sacred. This was the one day Emily had hoped to shield from the shadows of her family's dysfunction. And yet, here it was again, Victoria inserting herself into something that had nothing to do with her, bending it, breaking it, claiming it. Emily felt a wave of grief that surprised her in its intensity. It wasn't just about the dress. It was about everything the dress had meant. It was about the years she had spent forgiving things that were never acknowledged, never apologized for. It was about the version of herself she had slowly stitched together, delicate, imperfect, but hers, and watching someone else rip through it with practiced ease. She stood, slowly, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were glassy, her posture tight, but something had shifted. Not rage. Not even despair. Something quieter, colder. A clarity she had never felt before. The truth was, Victoria hadn't changed. But Emily had. And that difference would matter more than anything in the days ahead. For the first time in a long time, Emily stopped asking why. Why her sister always did this. Why her parents never stopped her. Why she kept letting it happen. The why didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was what came next. And this time, she wouldn't fold. She wouldn't retreat. She wouldn't simply replace what was stolen and smile politely through the pain. Emily sat in silence, her something had been taken from a mug of untouched but something else had now revealed. And though she hadn't planned it, lit only by the soft golden glow of the floor lamp and the flickering shadows cast by the wind pushing gently at the curtains. Not with a confrontation. Outside, the city moved on, cars passed, quiet, horns echoed in the distance, and unforgettable lives continued, but inside her world, time had stalled. She had always imagined this moment, the days before her wedding, as joyful, maybe even hectic in a good way, filled with last-minute laughter, nervous excitement, and the kind of anticipation that warms from the inside. Instead, all she felt was stillness. The kind that sits heavy on the chest. The kind that keeps you awake long after the lights go out. She couldn't bring herself to speak. Jake had offered comfort, his words soft and full of concern, but she had barely responded. Not out of anger, there was no rage left. It had evaporated into something harder to define, something quiet and sharp and internal. She couldn't explain what was happening, even to herself. She kept replaying it over and over in her mind, the way the closet had looked when she opened it and realized her dress was gone, the way her body had stilled in recognition, the weight of every prior betrayal crashing into that one instant. This wasn't just the loss of a dress. It was the quiet confirmation of something deeper. Something older. The realization that she had been wrong to hope things would ever be different. The next morning, she got out of bed not because she felt rested, but because she couldn't lie still any longer. The sheets felt suffocating. She moved mechanically through the day, her thoughts blurred, her movements minimal. She checked her phone only when necessary. She avoided messages from her mother and ignored one from Victoria entirely. There were calls to make, final confirmations to handle, decisions to finalize, but everything that once felt like joyful preparation now felt irrelevant. She didn't care about the playlist. She didn't care about the seating chart or the flavors of hors d'oeuvres. It all felt like a performance in a play she no longer wanted to act in. Her mind wandered back to childhood. She remembered moments she hadn't thought of in years, the Christmas when Victoria opened her present first, even though they had agreed Emily would the family vacation where her parents spent the entire trip praising Victoria's maturity while gently reminding Emily to be easier. She thought of birthdays where her cakes were store-bought while Victoria's were homemade, school achievements quietly passed over at dinner, art projects praised once and then forgotten. None of these memories had ever seemed monumental at the time. They were small, forgettable. But now, in this moment of betrayal, they formed a mosaic, one that revealed a truth she had refused to name. She had never been seen as equal. Not by her sister, not by her parents. She was background noise to someone else's spotlight. For years, she had tried to be the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over, who forgave quietly and loved unconditionally. She told herself that this was strength, that not fighting back was a sign of grace, that choosing understanding was more powerful than retaliation. But now, sitting in the kitchen with the clock ticking steadily on the wall and the calendar reminding her she was 2 days away from her wedding, she began to feel something shift. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't revenge. It was something clearer, something cleaner. A realization that her silence had never protected her. It had only enabled others. She thought of how Victoria would smirk and say things like "I was just trying to help," or "you're being too sensitive," and how often Emily had let those words define her. How many times she had swallowed hurt with a polite smile, convinced herself to let it go, to not make a scene. How she had twisted herself into a smaller shape just to keep the family peace. And now, looking at the empty closet, she understood that some silences are not graceful, they're cages. As the afternoon bled into evening, she began to feel the weight in her chest give way to something colder. There was no dress. There would be no apology. And even if her sister admitted what she had done, even if her parents begged her to not make drama, nothing could undo what had already been lost. What mattered now wasn't finding a replacement dress or pretending everything was fine. What mattered was choice. Her choice. For the first time, she wasn't going to pretend. She wasn't going to explain herself or beg to be believed. She was going to respond in her own way, on her own terms. She sat in the living room that evening, lights dimmed, laptop open. She began to type. Not a journal entry. Not a message to anyone in particular. Just a stream of facts. Memories. Incidents. Details that had once lived only in her mind. She remembered the way Victoria had told her ex that Emily had emotional issues when they were dating in college. She remembered how, after her first apartment flooded, Victoria had taken her in only to make her feel like a burden the entire time. She remembered the wedding planning group chat where her sister subtly undermined her choices until she left the chat altogether. Each story that had once lived in shame now came out with precision and clarity. By the time she finished typing, the room was dark. Her tea was still untouched. But the fog had lifted just enough for her to see the next step. She didn't have a plan yet. She didn't know how to fix what had been broken. But she knew one thing, she wasn't going to let this moment define her. Not like this. Not on someone else's terms. And so, in the quiet before the storm, Emily sat not in defeat, but in preparation. Not for a confrontation, not for vengeance, but for truth. The truth that had lived beneath the surface her entire life. The truth she had always known, but never dared to speak aloud. And this time, when she acted, it wouldn't be with permission or apology. It would be with certainty. The morning before the wedding arrived like the hush before a storm, still and unnerving in its calm. Emily stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her face pale from lack of sleep, her eyes rimmed with the quiet fire of decision. The apartment around her was still, but inside, her thoughts churned with cold precision. She had spent the last 24 hours oscillating between disbelief and clarity, and now the latter had taken firm root. There was no more room for heartbreak. Only action. Not the reckless, emotional kind, but something quieter, more dangerous in its calmness. A plan born not from pettiness but necessity. She knew Victoria had taken the dress. Not just suspected, knew. And not as some misguided attempt to be funny or to borrow something beautiful. No, it had been deliberate. Calculated. A final play in a long history of moves that always ended with Emily retreating. And this time, Victoria had made her biggest mistake. She had underestimated the version of Emily she had created. The version that had grown up quietly watching, learning, and absorbing the sharpness of the world her sister thrived in. And now, she would use that knowledge. Emily's first step was simple. She would not ask for the dress back. That was the old version of her, the one who begged, reasoned, and hoped. This Emily would move forward as if the theft didn't matter. She would not chase an apology that would never come. Instead, she would find something else to wear. Not a rental. Not a rushed online order. But something symbolic. Something that would turn the very act of betrayal into a statement. She remembered the white silk gown Victoria had worn to her own wedding 3 years earlier, a dress that still hung in their mother's attic, sealed in plastic, preserved like a relic. It was beautiful, traditional, everything Victoria believed symbolized control and perfection. Wearing that dress would send a message so sharp it didn't need to be spoken. Her second step was mental preparation. She knew her parents would sense the tension but pretend not to. That had always been their dynamic, an unspoken contract of emotional denial. They would praise Victoria's taste, admire how helpful she'd been in the planning, and urge Emily to focus on the joy of the day. They would not mention the missing dress. They would not ask questions. And if Emily told them the truth, they would flinch, but only for a moment, before recoiling into silence and half-hearted attempts at neutrality. That was the part she had accepted long ago. They weren't malicious, just cowardly. Always desperate for comfort, never willing to confront discomfort, especially when it came wrapped in family ties. So she wouldn't seek their validation. She would let them stand on the sidelines of her story while she rewrote the ending herself. She made a list, short, pointed. Call the seamstress who had altered Victoria's dress and request a rush adjustment. Arrange for delivery of the gown to her apartment that same day. Coordinate with the photographer, not to change the plan, but to prepare them for a minor twist in the timeline. She wouldn't tell them everything, just enough. That she'd be wearing a different dress. That she wanted the focus not on tradition, but on emotion. Authenticity. The truth of a woman stepping into her moment with her eyes open. Next came the vows. She opened the notebook where she had scrawled her first draft weeks ago, filled with metaphors and hopes and bright optimism. It was beautiful, but it wasn't enough anymore. She crossed out entire paragraphs, pen moving with certainty, her thoughts sharpened by pain but guided by resolve. She wrote about transformation, about choosing oneself, about loving without needing to shrink. She wrote not to impress guests or appease tradition, but to anchor herself to something real, something that no one could steal. The vows became her armor. Her refusal to be erased. Jake, throughout it all, had respected her space. He had offered quiet support without asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. That, more than anything, affirmed her choice. He saw her, not as an extension of someone else's narrative, not as a fragile victim, but as a woman taking back her story. And while she didn't tell him every detail, she knew he sensed the shift. The calm in her voice. The steadiness in her actions. He didn't need the whole picture to trust the direction she was heading. Later that afternoon, the dress arrived. When she unzipped the garment bag, her breath caught, not from longing, but from irony. It was exactly as she remembered. Pristine. Dramatic. A symbol of everything Victoria cherished, attention, elegance, control. And now it would serve a new purpose. Emily wasn't wearing it out of spite. She was wearing it as reclamation. She had no desire to humiliate her sister or create a scene. Her goal wasn't revenge, it was liberation. To prove, to herself most of all, that she could transform what was meant to break her into something powerful. She hung the dress on the door and stepped back. For a moment, she imagined Victoria's reaction, not of guilt, but of disbelief. Because in her sister's world, Emily had always been the one who accepted, who yielded, who forgave quietly and moved on. The idea of Emily making a move that redefined the rules would be unthinkable. But that was the point. That was the plan. To rewrite her role without permission. To reclaim the story without waiting for consensus. She packed the essentials for the wedding day, makeup, jewelry, comfortable shoes for dancing later. Each item felt like a tool now, not just decoration. She chose earrings that had belonged to their grandmother, a woman who had endured silently for decades and passed down both beauty and sorrow through bloodlines. She chose flat shoes that would let her move freely, without the discomfort of performance. She braided her hair herself, methodically, each twist a meditation, a reminder that her hands still built her world. As evening approached, the apartment filled with soft light. The sky outside turned a dusky lavender, signaling the final turn before the storm. But Emily didn't feel fear. The nerves were still there, alive, electric, but beneath them was something stronger. An understanding of her own strength. A quiet, unshakable certainty. Tomorrow, she would walk down the aisle. Not as the girl who had her dress stolen, but as the woman who made that theft irrelevant. And that was the plan. Not retaliation. Not confrontation. Just truth, sharpened and wrapped in silk, walking forward without apology. The wedding day dawned quietly, the sky a muted gray that seemed to hold its breath. A soft mist clung to the air, neither rain nor fog, just a veil of moisture that made everything shimmer with a faint, dreamlike softness. The world outside moved with its usual rhythm, cars on distant roads, birds tracing slow arcs above rooftops, but inside the bridal suite, time seemed to move differently. Slower. Deeper. Emily stood by the window, wrapped in a linen robe, the dress hanging silently behind her. The room was warm with low light and the faint hum of curling irons and whispered instructions, but her mind was focused, untouched by the noise around her. This was her moment. The culmination of 1,000 small betrayals and one singular choice. The quiet before the spectacle. And though the air buzzed with tension, she felt only clarity. The dress, Victoria's dress, hung with a kind of weight that went beyond fabric. It was more than satin and lace now. It was a symbol. Not of surrender, but of reclamation. Emily had spent the morning preparing in solitude, allowing only a few close friends to help with final touches, and even then, only in silence. There were no shared jokes or Instagram stories, no excited screams or sentimental tears. This wasn't that kind of wedding morning. This was something else entirely. Something sacred. Something sharp. She had braided her hair with precision, wrapped strands of soft gold into the twist like armor, her eyes lined not with glamour, but with control. Her lips were painted a shade darker than usual, a quiet defiance against the pastel palettes and soft florals chosen by her mother months ago. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw, for the first time in a long while, not the girl trying to be enough, but the woman who no longer cared to try. As the time drew near, the guests began to settle into the ceremony space. White chairs arranged in perfect symmetry, strings of lights woven through the treetops, soft music swelling under hushed conversation. They were there for a wedding, yes, but they were also witnesses. Whether they knew it or not, they were about to see something that would ripple through whispered dinners and family gossip for years to come. Emily's parents sat in the front row, their faces masks of composed joy, trying not to look at one another too much. Her mother adjusted her clutch repeatedly, her father checked his watch more than necessary. Victoria stood nearby, dressed in a blush satin gown, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flicked around the ceremony space, landing briefly on the aisle, then darting away. As far as she knew, everything was proceeding as planned. But then came the shift. The hush. That sacred second before everything changes. The music softened. Heads turned. Cameras were raised. The officiant nodded once toward the back, and then Emily stepped into view. For a moment, the world held its breath. The sun, as if cued by fate itself, slipped through the clouds and bathed the aisle in golden light. And there she was. Wearing the stolen dress. The very one Victoria had once declared the most perfect expression of timeless elegance. The same dress that had been hidden away, claimed by one sister as her own legacy, now reimagined by the other as an act of quiet rebellion. Emily walked slowly, each step deliberate, her gaze fixed ahead. The dress fit her differently, not just in shape, but in presence. Where it once symbolized control, it now radiated freedom. The fabric moved not like submission, but like power. Not like tradition, but like truth. There was no dramatic reaction, no gasps or shouted accusations. But the silence itself spoke volumes. Victoria's face paled, her jaw tightened, but she did not move. Emily never once looked in her direction. Her focus was singular. Jake stood at the altar, eyes wide not with confusion, but with awe. He saw her. All of her. The transformation, the truth, the fire she had carried through the quiet devastation. And as she reached him, as they stood together in front of everyone who had ever shaped or shattered them, Emily felt not nervousness, but serenity. The officiant began to speak, but Emily barely heard the words. Her senses were tuned to the weight of the moment, the stillness of those watching, the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. This was no longer a wedding in the traditional sense. It was a reckoning. A declaration. A turning point. Every eye in the crowd could feel it, the shift in energy, the unraveling of long-kept assumptions, the realization that something unspoken was finally being said. Her vows, when spoken, did not tremble. They were not filled with the usual poetic flourishes or curated sentiment. They were grounded. Direct. A promise not just to love Jake, but to remain rooted in her own truth. To never again shrink herself for comfort, to never again mistake silence for peace. She spoke of honesty, of evolution, of choosing not just a partner but a life built on authenticity. And Jake, in turn, met her with words that didn't seek to fix her, but to honor her. To join her in that truth. As they exchanged rings, the wind picked up slightly, lifting the hem of the dress as if even nature acknowledged the symbolism. When the officiant pronounced them married, the applause came hesitantly at first, then fuller, but still wrapped in that peculiar silence. A silence that knew something more had happened here than just a ceremony. It was as if the guests sensed the weight of a private war that had finally reached its public conclusion. And though no one dared say it aloud, everyone knew the story would echo far beyond the photos and toasts. As they walked back up the aisle together, hand in hand, Emily felt no triumph. No vindication. Just relief. Like something heavy had been set down. Like she had finally stepped out of someone else's shadow and into her own light. Behind her, she didn't look back. Not once. Not at the guests. Not at her parents. Not at Victoria. Because the moment had already said everything that needed to be said. After the ceremony, the world resumed its normal pace as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. The guests filtered toward the reception hall, chatting lightly, clinking champagne glasses, commenting on the flowers and the playlist. On the surface, it looked like any other wedding. Polished. Joyful. But beneath the sheen of celebration, there was an undercurrent of unsettled energy, something subtle and electric, like the space left behind after lightning. Emily moved through it all with poise, offering smiles, greeting family, responding to congratulations. But there was no mistaking the shift in her presence. She didn't float or perform, she walked like someone who had crossed a threshold and was no longer afraid of the noise behind her. The dress remained pristine throughout the evening, untouched by food or wine or dance. It was not the dress she had imagined wearing when she first dreamed of her wedding, but now it was the only dress that made sense. The symbolism clung to it like scent, every fold, every stitch a quiet confrontation. Even those who hadn't noticed during the ceremony were now beginning to whisper, drawing connections. Aunts and cousins exchanged loaded glances, their comments half-spoken. Her mother laughed too loudly at innocuous jokes, her eyes flicking constantly toward Victoria. Her father stayed close to the bar, his glass always half full, his gaze trained on nothing in particular. Victoria herself maintained an impressive facade. She smiled when necessary, posed for family photos, sipped her drink with calculated ease. But her edges had cracked. Just slightly. Enough for anyone watching closely to see it, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her laughter came half a second too late. She hadn't confronted Emily yet. Not publicly. And perhaps she wouldn't. Because doing so would mean acknowledging what had happened. And Victoria had built her whole identity on never appearing rattled. But the damage was done. Not in the way she had expected. Emily hadn't embarrassed her, hadn't outed her actions, hadn't even so much as made eye contact. And somehow, that silence had cut deeper than accusation ever could. Later, when the cake had been sliced and the first dances had ended, Emily slipped out onto the terrace alone. The night air was cool and still, the string lights casting a warm halo over the stone railing. She leaned against it, shoes in hand, listening to the muffled music inside. She had made it through. The ceremony, the reception, the tension. But she knew something had shifted permanently. Not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. And while the victory was hers, it had come at a cost. She would no longer be the soft-spoken one, the mediator, the easy daughter. That role had dissolved the moment she chose to wear that dress. And though she felt no regret, she could already feel the weight of what would follow. There would be quiet resentments, polite distance, revisionist narratives. Her parents would try to smooth things over, of course, urging forgiveness, pretending the deeper wound wasn't there. They would say things like family is all we have, without once acknowledging what they had chosen to ignore. They would ask her to consider her sister's feelings, to keep the peace. But peace had never existed, not really. Only performance. Victoria would likely retaliate in subtler ways. Frozen smiles at holidays, passive comments disguised as concern, small efforts to undermine her new confidence. But Emily wasn't worried. She had finally found something more important than being liked. She had found freedom in truth. In not needing to explain or apologize. In walking down the aisle on her own terms. And while the consequences of that choice would ripple for months, even years, she would endure them. Not because she was unbreakable, but because she was finally whole. Inside, Jake found her. He didn't say anything, just stood beside her, offering his presence like a lighthouse. And that was enough. She didn't need grand declarations or perfect words. Just the comfort of someone who saw the storm and stayed anyway. When they left the venue that night, they didn't linger. They didn't wait for a send-off or gather well-wishers. They simply exited. Quietly. Intentionally. Into the dark, hand in hand. The ride home was silent at first, the city lights blurring past the windows like smeared stars. Emily looked out at them, thinking not of what had been lost, but of what had been claimed. She thought of her grandmother, of the stories that had never been told, the generational silences passed down like heirlooms. She thought of all the women who had swallowed their anger, folded their pain into politeness, turned their betrayal into decorum. She thought of them and realized she had broken that chain. Not loudly. Not cruelly. But decisively. The wedding would be remembered, yes. But not for the flowers or the playlist or the venue. It would be remembered for the unspoken thing that hung over every toast and photo, the choice to no longer play along. And maybe that would make some uncomfortable. Maybe it would change the dynamic forever. But maybe that was the point. To grow out of what no longer fits. Even when it once belonged to someone else. Emily didn't know what the next chapter would look like. Whether Victoria would eventually call. Whether the family would ever fully understand. But she didn't need to know. The truth had already set itself in motion. And it would carry her forward, no matter how the others chose to respond. The cost of justice, she realized, wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. The kind that burns away illusion and leaves only what's real. And in that clarity, she felt something unexpected: peace. Not the passive kind, but the earned kind. The kind that comes after the storm, when the air smells like rain and the ground is steady beneath your feet.